Hello and welcome to Coffee and Politics on F15, a bi-weekly show that airs every other Sunday on US politics. Today I will be talking to someone who ran for Congress in New York's 13th district this year and recently founded an organization that tries to help real people with real solutions on the ground in real time. Welcome, Richard Habersham, founder of Solutions Now.
Thank you, Sophie. It's good to be here.
So members of Congress have a notoriously high re-election rate, over 90%. I would like to ask you, what made you decide to put everything on hold and run for Congress yourself?
Well, that's always a good question. And I guess, one should be able to answer it and probably more briefly than I can. But I think that it was a convergence of events. I think, Donald Trump being elected in 2016 definitely was, something that really, really rocked my world. And, and particularly when it became clear the direction in which Donald Trump was steering the country, everyone, I thought to myself, I've got to do something. And, we're always taught that, if you're upset about something, why not, go out and try to change it. And I really felt that it was time for people, regular people, I guess we're all regular, but regular folks to say, hey, if we don't take control of our government, then we are going to continue to have people like Donald Trump in office. And that sort of started it. I'd always been unhappy with the way in which things had operated in my district. I'm from Harlem, which is probably one of the most famous AfricanAmerican communities in the country. And I had always questioned why things were run so poorly there. I think that, it's probably one of the poorest districts in the country. We've got, 1 out of 4 people don't graduate out of high school. Actually more than that, 3 out of 4 people don't graduate out of high school. 40% of the people are below the poverty level. We have the more public housing units in our district than almost any other district in the country. The list just goes on. And, so there's no shortage of problems in my district that need to be addressed. And my thoughts that one of the biggest complaints, that we just needed someone more thoughtful, someone with good ideas, that actually was engaged, not a career politician. And to your point about incumbency, so many of these guys get this job for life and they aren't able to, they get very, very comfortable. And once they do get comfortable, their level of creativity when it comes to, or their passion for solving some of the problems that the community has sort of dwindles. So that's a long way of saying, like, that's probably why, or that is why, I threw my hat in.
So you mentioned that you're from Harlem and that in congressional terms, that's New York's 13th congressional district. And could you tell us a bit about— New York's 13th congressional district.
Yes, and it has a storied history as well. Obviously Charlie Rangel was the congressman represented the district for 44 years. And before him, a gentleman by the name of Adam Clayton Powell represented the district for 37 some odd years. So the district has really only been it's been guided by 2 men for the overwhelming majority of its existence when it became a Black district back in the 30s. And Adam Clayton Powell was one of my heroes growing up, even though he died before I was born. But he was one of the most influential African-American congressmen and one of the first African-American congressmen in the U.S. Congress post-Reconstruction. And one of the things that he really, really championed was, economic boycotts, which was, don't work, don't shop where you can't work. And, and he doesn't get enough credit for it, but he did that in the 40s. And by the time you get Martin Luther King in 1955, 1957 at Montgomery, he's he's employing some of the same tactics that Adam Clayton Powell did in Harlem back, in the 30s and the 40s. So, there's a lot of great history around Adam Clayton Powell, a lot of great history around Harlem. Charlie Rangel, served for a bit longer. I think his record is a bit more mixed. I think that his heart was in the right place. That he, and that there were some good things that happened. We were deemed an empowerment zone, which basically says that things are so messed up in your district that you get extra money. And that money, one can say went to lots of different entities. And I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the entities that it went to, but some people say Harlem is a nicer place these days. But I think really what they're probably trying to say is it's gentrified. But the core problems that always plague the neighborhood are still there. It's still a tremendous amount of poverty, as we've discussed. The education system is still failing. And, there is still, there's still lack of ownership or lack of equity by people of color of the community. They don't own anything there, or they own very, very little of the community. And therefore, it's hard to control the destiny of the community when you don't own much. So those are some of the issues that I was into. I loved the idea of rent to own. I think, why should people be throwing their rent out for 30 years when, they could perhaps put their rent towards a mortgage and basically own where they live. And this way they would care more about it, and it would have some value, and it would, also make them feel more at home in their own communities. So these were the kind of things that I was really, really excited about, and economic empowerment was, at its base, one of the more important things and themes that, I attempted to bring, more attention to during my campaign.
So was that the encouraging property ownership part of your core agenda when you were running? And could you name a couple other policy proposals that you had, what you wanted to see changed?
Rent to own was my main one. I thought that because my district had more housing units than almost any other district, except for the adjacent district in New York. I think there's another New York district that has a few more units than we do, that perhaps allowing, again, people in public housing to rent to own their own place or their public housing unit. I thought that was a great idea. Some of the other things that we were really into technology as well. We really thought that the jobs of the future, are going to revolve around technology. And how do we position young folks that are right now in school to get some of those high paying jobs? And, and along the way, we found out some really, really critical things. Like, for example, if to get the higher paying technology jobs of the future, one probably needs about a 10th grade math education, which in most schools is like algebra trig, which is just at the point at which, so to really, really, really take advantage of the future, we were going to have to do things like, make sure that folks are getting educated enough to actually get those jobs, so, just teaching someone to code and do these things that we hear all these things about, oh, they're in a coding class or whatever, might not necessarily translate to the type of employment opportunities that we had in mind. So we were really, really, really trying to position Harlem and position the younger folks in Harlem. And I emphasize younger folks for, more for this computer stuff, but also how do we retrain the folks that, middle-aged folks, and there's something else that we figured out, that then this is sort of what would bled into some of the work that I'm doing now, that there are so many laws on the books already that if they were interpreted the right way, help. They're just either being ignored or not being used. So, the emphasis always comes when you talk to a politician of what can I do to go to Washington to pass the bill. The reality was, I figured out pretty early, was that, as a freshman congressperson in Washington, you're not going to be able to get much done. So how do we look at existing laws, right? And make sure that they are executed in the manner in which they should be, or in a manner that favors the community. So we found, a lot of subsections of housing law that said, for example, the Section 3 of of housing, urban, and development policy towards the projects said, for example, that if you have a contract of over $100,000 in the New York City housing, in New York City housing, you should have at least a third of the people on your workforce should come from the project. Now, I know for a fact that there's $61 billion in estimated repairs that need to be done to NYCHA all over the city. 61 billion. If that would, I see work being done on NYCHA buildings all the time, and it's clear to me that most of the people that are working there, if not all the people there, are not from the NYCHA building. Mm-hmm. So how do we get better enforcement? And that's complicated. It's that there's obviously ways that contractors get around hiring people. So why don't we figure out ways to, to stop those kind of practices and make sure that existing laws are followed? So that was more of where I was coming from, not this sort of like, I'm going to go to Congress and, I'm going to be able to change, the community overnight. But I thought that the clout that would come with it and the focus, the thoughtful focus that I would, the laser precision focus that I would put on some of the issues in the community might, be able to change the trajectory at least slightly from what it is today.
Mm-hmm. And you referenced the sort of futility of showing up in Congress thinking you can change so much when in reality it's much tougher. And so if I'm not mistaken, you suspended your campaign as the coronavirus epidemic hit and founded a nonprofit organization that does exactly that and tries to find real solutions for people in real time, which you could say is the opposite of what happens if you go to Congress. So could you tell us about how you founded that, what the idea was?
Perfect segue. Yeah, I mean, during the campaign, it came up that we wanted to create a storefront, let's just say, called Solutions Now, and people from the community could come into this storefront, and let's say they were looking for a scholarship, or let's say they were looking for healthcare for their parents, let's say they were looking for, a job training, that the people who staff the Solution Now office, this was the dream, right? This is what during the campaign we thought, would be able to give them thoughtful advice on who they could speak to, what government agencies offer. In other words, they would be knowledgeable enough to navigate through the bureaucracy of federal, state, and local programs, right? So that was the dream. So once we did suspend our campaign due to the COVID, we decided, COVID-19, not call it the COVID, we decided that that might be a great way that there's so many people, and I said this a lot during the campaign, you can go in New York from 96th Street and Park Avenue is probably where it's most stark. You can be walking down the street and you can be on one block where you have some of the wealthiest people in the world, literally, and walk 2 blocks to 98th Street and Park and be literally around some of the poorest people in the country, right? Mm-hmm. So I know that I've come from a background where I knew a lot of people who were wealthy. I didn't come from a wealthy background. I'm born and raised in Harlem. But I know that these folks want to help. And I know that there's so many resources in New York. New York has some of the best museums in the country. New York has some of the best universities in the country. New York has some of, the best doctors, the best scientists, the best everything. Why can't we harness that? Why can't we get those folks to do more in these communities? And my thing was, I think a lot of them want to do more. So the whole idea of Solutions Now was, how do we use the world-class talent that is in New York, and how do we refocus that talent or allow those people the opportunity to share some of their wisdom and some of their work experiences and some of their expertise with underserved communities. So that's sort of the idea of where it started. And again, there's also 60 billionaires that live in New York. It's incredible that, that it would seem to me that, there is enough generosity in New York where these people could really, really move the needle when it comes to helping some of the more underserved communities in New York. So that's sort of how it started. That between that and the idea of the storefront is how we got Solutions Now. And to be frank, when we started Solutions Now, I had hoped that it was more high-minded for me, right? It was like sort of what I was, the macro thing, like the 60 billionaires and all of this talent that's in New York that's just not being used. But the more acute problem was, food insecurity, right? So, over 2 million people in New York right now, as we speak, are go hungry. So how do you go after education and all these other high-minded things that we want to do when we're not trying to solve some of the more, basic problems? You can't learn if you can't eat. So that was sort of where Solutions Now had an opportunity to start making an immediate impact. And over the course of, since April till today, we've distributed close to 150,000 meals through World Central Kitchen. And I should say also that, I couldn't have done this alone. I do have a co-founder by the name of Erin Ruby, and she's been, together, we've really, really been able to try to, I guess what our challenge is, I would say, is keeping everybody excited. If you keep doing food and food and food, even though people need food, it's hard to get a staff it's hard to attract the creative energy, because people after a while say, well, what are you, just a food organization? So what part of our challenges is to do some of the things that we know need to be done. There's tremendous hurt and tremendous poverty, tremendous, need for so many things. There's homelessness, there's domestic violence issues, there's, kids are not going to school, obviously. They're not even coming to the Zoom thing, and the gaps that's creating. Kids that are in at-risk situations at home, who were used to being able to go to school to get away from those situations, are now home all day in those situations. So, there's so much stuff that's going on that is so crazy. And it's been exacerbated by COVID-19. It's been hard to get to the more high-minded stuff, but it's there, and we're developing it. And that's sort of some of the stuff that we're working on going forward, which I'd love to discuss with you as well.
Another example of a concrete project that you had was taking seniors to the polls. Could you tell us a bit about this? It's about the presidential election amidst the pandemic in New York City. Could you tell us how that went?
Well, it was really successful. It was great. I think a lot of times it's like, working with getting people to vote. Voter participation has been very, very traditionally low in a lot of African-American communities. And this is something that's stunning to me, but I think that the beginning, how you address that is much like going to the gym, and it's got to be a little bit of a muscle memory. So what we wanted to do is make it as easy as possible for folks to vote, with the idea that if they vote in this election, that maybe they'll vote in the next election. And as you know, in your work, and particularly in American politics, everyone comes out for the presidential, and that's the one that has the highest rate of participation. But the ones that act the most impactful, elections are the local ones, and the ones that would actually could, really, really impact people's lives positively are the ones that people usually don't even go out to. So when there is an opportunity, and particularly when you have, personality like Donald Trump, a contrast between a personality like Donald Trump and Vice President-elect or President-elect Biden, between the contrast between those two was enough to sort of generate the kind of enthusiasm, on both sides, unfortunately, to make sure that their vote was counted. So the program went extremely well. We took probably close to 250 seniors to the polls. A lot of the days were raining, and days that folks probably would not have gone out, but we thought it was successful, and it was sort of a layup. We're trying to do smaller things, even though logistically, I will say these things are far more difficult than sort of me, who was like, oh, we just get a bus and put them on. It's like, where do you pick them up? It's got the bathroom. How do you do it in COVID? All these things that just made it, a little bit more complicated than just, oh, we're going to show up with a bus and you sign up and da-da-da-da-da. Getting people to sign up. Where do they find out about it? Or is it on Facebook? Is it, in their lobby, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that I'm proud of. And we're also started doing something that is really, really, really fascinating, which is this employment thing. So my whole thing has always been, while it's great the emphasis has always been, well, and someone brought up Vienna the other day, and again, I don't know enough about what goes on there. But one of the things that's always really, really bothered me is that there's always been this emphasis on bringing, children of color and underserved communities, getting them to go to college with this idea that, college is going to solve the problem, right? And whereas if you look at American history through, if you look at American immigration history, it becomes very, very clear that all first generation immigrants that came here usually, didn't immediately go to college. Most of them, worked in the trades. They either, just became, shop owners, in the case of, some of the ones that came here by foot, like landscaping, plumbing, electricians, more of these vocational jobs that actually, you doing something with your hand that are actually skilled. Mm-hmm. It's always really, really upset me because the first default thing, and they do this to everybody, but particularly in our community, you got to go to college. And there are people who are not college material. That doesn't mean that they don't have the aptitude for college per se, but that, that their interests lie in doing something more with their hands. And right now, if you have a degree in philosophy, there's probably not a good chance that you're going to get a job if you need to eat tonight, talking about philosophy. However, if you knew how to landscape, you might be able to go to somebody's lawn tonight or tomorrow morning, mow it and do some work and walk away with, $30 or $40, and so it's great to know chess, but chess isn't really helpful if everybody in your town plays checkers, right? Mm-hmm. So, it's sort of that. So we're working on a program now where we're trying to find candidates, younger folks, men, women, not so much younger folks. We keep saying younger folks. I mean, it tends to be younger folks, but it doesn't have to be younger folks. Figure out a way in which to get them into programs where they get certifications in construction, certifications in trades, and then partner with construction companies that, that might be interested in giving a kid that, a shot, because a welder makes $100 an hour here in New York, mm-hmm. And if you can bring one kid out of poverty, if you can bring one kid home with $100 with a $1,200 check or $1,500 check every week, or perhaps more, my math is wrong, you are not only helping his grandmother, you're helping his mother, and you're helping his children. And he's also setting an example within the community to say, oh, he's got a job welding, and look how well he's doing. Now he's got a car and all these other stuff. So you are really, really, not only are you positively impacting, you've brought a family out of poverty through these jobs, but you've also shown a model to other people like, hey, maybe I should do that. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's, whereas a college degree, I'm not anti-college, because I don't want to be, because the first thing people are like, well, you're saying don't go to college. That's not what I'm saying. I want to be clear. But what I am saying, for a lot of these kids, college is just not realistic, and it's just not a realistic, benchmark for them. And it might not even it might not even change their situation dramatically at all. So that's sort of what we're dealing with, trying to find partners who will employ these kids, trying to raise money to teach these kids skills and vocations. So that was sort of one of the more exciting, high-minded things that we're doing that doesn't involve food insecurity and homelessness and some of the more, some of the more frustrating problems that are chronic and that are now worse than they usually are, but that are consistently plaguing New York and underserved communities.
Mm-hmm. So you also mentioned that the African-American voter turnout is traditionally quite low. Why do you think that is?
I think that there is a widespread perception by many African Americans, by many Blacks, that their vote, that the fix is in, that one side is just as full of it as the other side, and that it's not really going to matter, And I think that is born from, decades, if not centuries, if not a century-long, struggle for equal rights, and it's something that's very, very disturbing to me, because when, as a student of history myself, I understand, just what people went through, and the violence, let's just call it that, just straight up violence that was inflicted on people who tried to vote, and just how difficult it was from an intellectual point of view. Like, I mean, not even an intellectual point of view, just the lawyers, the people on the front end that were fighting this, legally, and then the people who were actually, showing up to polls, with armed people with guns pointed at them saying, "Can I vote?" I mean, it just was such it took so much to get the right to vote. And for some reason, and not for some reason, for reasons that probably make sense, that Black folks aren't voting. And I think it's the number one biggest issue. And you look at what Stacey Abrams did down in Georgia, and, you say to yourself, I don't think anybody in their wildest dreams could have imagined before this election that Georgia would be up for grabs. And it actually was that was the biggest surprise of anything that night, was that, or in the days that followed, that Georgia, that Stacey Abrams, I think registered like over 500 or 600,000 people to vote. And that made the difference. And it's also, and I'll talk about her for just a second, that obviously she lost a close election in 2018, one that, that there's a lot of sort of, chatter about whether or not it was fair or not, because the guy who beat her, who's now the Governor Kemp, was the Secretary of State and in charge of, all of the voting process, right? He was in charge of the election system fundamentally in Georgia. And, there was a lot of, hanky-panky that went on, let's just say. But for her to not, to lick her wounds by saying, you know what, not only, all right, you got me, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to register, X amount of, it's just absolutely amazing. And we owe her a debt of gratitude, because, that even though he would have won without Georgia, all the pressure that he has put on, various state systems, it's the idea that it's so many states that Donald Trump has lost, that makes it so that it's impossible for him to exert the incredible amount of leverage that he has with his voting base and overturn the election. So that's. I hope I've answered your question, but that is, I don't know why they're not voting more, but I am dedicated towards. It's not that I don't know why. It's a super big problem, but we're on the right track with people like Stacey Abrams and people who are now more focused on that than ever.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great note to end on. I have one more question for you. Would you consider running for political office again, coming up sometime?
Solutions Now has been great. It's sort of like instant gratification. It's sort of like, you can either run, like we said, you can go and try to get in Congress, and, you can wait around for 10 or 15 years to amass some sort of power there. And then, and get a bill passed that is near and dear to your heart, or you think is really going to be impactful for your community. But that's a 15-year stretch, What we're doing in the community, when I see our first guy go off to, and become a welder and brings home a check for, $2,000, $3,000, and everyone's happy, like, that's sort of what drives me, right? That's what really gets me excited. And I don't have to wait 15 years for that. That could be, by the end of next year, So, so that's really thing. And I can tell you, I was very, very, the fundraising, the amount of money that's in politics was something that now, having seen what everyone says, oh, I know there's money in politics. Yeah. But when you really realize how much money is in politics, and that part of my job every day was to get on the phone at 10 and not put the phone down until 4, calling people, asking them to donate to a campaign. That is the reality of what politics is for a guy like me. Now, if I was born rich, if you're a Kennedy or something, or you have a fundraising apparatus in place, which most people do not, which most politicians do not, then that's what you're doing all day. You know, you think that everyone thinks, you know, you're talking to the people, you're doing this, you're fundraising. And that can be exhausting. And that can be exhausting. And it can be, and in an election cycle, that will be what you're doing from, you know, 18 months before the election all the way to the election. And that as psychologically can be very, very daunting to say, I'm going to be doing this Groundhog Day thing of picking up the phone, doing. So to answer your question, you know, I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. You know, you never say never in politics. So I'm not, you know, but I am enjoying what I'm doing with Solutions Now. And we'll see about the future. I just don't know yet.
Well, that's great. There are many ways to make an impact, and running for office is only one of them. And it sounds like Solutions Now is doing really amazing work. So I wish you all the best in the future with it.
Sophie, you are a rock star. Thanks so much for having us, and thanks so much for listening to our story and following our exploits, whether it be political or what we're doing in charity. So thank you.
My pleasure.